Welcome to the ninth session of the Foundations of Economic Thought Open Online course, hosted by the Penn Initiative for the Study of Markets at the University of Pennsylvania. So we're delighted to have you with us. Today's session, as always, will run for 90 minutes, starting with a 60 to 75 minutes lecture, followed by 15 to 30 minutes of live questions and answers. Again, you are welcome to submit your questions at any time using the Zoom Q&A feature. Due to scheduling adjustments, we have to slightly reorder the course. Building on last week's discussion on Keynes, today we turn to one of his most prominent intellectual rivals in the 20th century, Friedrich Hayek. To guide us through Hayek ideas, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Bruce Caldwell, a leading authority on Hayek's thought. Dr. Caldwell is Research Professor of Economics and the Director of the Center for the History of Political Economy at Duke University. He's the author of Hayek's Challenge and co-author of Hayek Alive, 1899 to 1950, the first volume of Hayek's authorized biography. As general editor of the collected works of F. A. Hayek since 2002, he has played a central role in shaping our understanding of Hayek's legacy. So please, Professor, go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much, Fernando, for the invitation to appear in this series. I thought I would first alert everyone that there is a handout. So hopefully everyone has got a copy of the handout, and I will be referring to it as I go through my talk. On the first page is F. A. Hayek, a chronology. So I'll talk a little bit about his life, the times in which he was living. And then on the other side is Hayek's contributions in various areas, and then we'll spend quite a bit of time looking at the various places that he's made a contribution to economics and other fields. One reason I think that Hayek is a fascinating figure to study, and you'll be able to see this if you take a look at the chronology page. He was born in 1899 and he died in 1992. So his life was contemporaneous with the 20th century. It's a 20th century life. And he was remarkable in that he managed to be at various places at various points in time that were significant in the history of economics. We'll see this as we go through the chronology. And so he was a person who was at the right place at the right time for interacting with major figures within the profession. But he always had ideas that were quite different. And in general, people thought he was wrong, and he thought they were wrong. So he would argue with them. And indeed, I know you've been treated to John Maynard Keynes. We'll see that was one of the rivalries, but there's many others. And it was he's a great figure to study. He's a figure that you can study for himself, but he also sheds a light on the development of economics in the 20th century. So particularly for a course like this, I think he's an important sort of person to allow us to do that. So let's go through the chronology. So born in Vienna in 1899, this is fin de siècle Vienna. It's a period of great cultural, political, intellectual, artistic ferment, creativity, and tension. You have, just go through some of the people. This is where Sigmund Freud was practicing in art, people like Klimt and Kokoschka, architecture, all sorts of innovations in architecture. Ernst Mach within the physical sciences was dictating not only influential within physics, but also with the approach to sciences. He was an influential figure in the later Vienna Circle. They took him as his methods as methods to be followed. Zionism got its start in Vienna at this period. So he was born into a lower upper middle class family, if we can put it that way. Got his education before the war, fought in World War I. He was a soldier on the Austrian front. And by the way, as Fernando said, I have both worked on Hayek's intellectual contributions, but also on his life. So during the Q&A at any point, if you want to go more into the life side, we can go into that as well. He had some bizarre stories of life at the front during World War I, if people are interested. Anyway, he returns after the war, goes to the University of Vienna. He studies under a man named von Fieser. But the person that was most influential in his later life was Ludwig von Mises. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the contributions. I'll just point out there that while he's at the University of Vienna, he did something that was a very Viennese sort of thing to do. They organized, some of the students that he knew organized a discussion group that would meet every couple of weeks, and they'd meet in each other's houses. Someone would present a paper, and then the paper would be discussed by all the people who were joined. And this group, called the Geistkreis, circle of spirits, as it were, is a group that was just randomly formed. But if you take a look at some of the people who were participating in it, particularly within the Austrian tradition within economics, you've got Fritz Machlup and Gottfried Haberler, but you've also got, quite outside the Austrian tradition, Oscar Morgenstern, who with John von Neumann was the developer of game theory. So these are people that he knew just as a student who would get together in a general way to talk about papers. A very Viennese sort of episode. After finishing his studies, he had a chance to go to the United States, and he spent 15 months there, and he visited the classroom of Wesley Clair Mitchell. He was actually stationed at NYU, but he was gate crashing, as he put it, classes at other places, trying things out. So he met Mitchell. I don't know if he was mentioned within the course, but this is basically one of the founders of American institutionalism. So he came, and Mitchell in 1925 was the president of the American Economic Association. So he's an influential economist, both within the tradition of history of thought, but certainly within American economics. By the way, I'll just simply point out, Hayek hated New York. He spent 15 months there. He thought, oh man, this is horrible. And this is New York in the early 20s. It's just when all of the building was taking place. Massive buildings were being erected. The subway system was being extended. And you could see the noise, was the way that some people who described this period put it. He also was not used to American culture. He complained how you come across someone in the street, you can't even tell what class they are. Oh, this was horrible to an upper middle class European trying to figure out American culture. So he didn't much like it then. Which is ironic because he ends up spending 12 years later at the University of Chicago. So he ends up living in the United States. But his initial experience was not something that he particularly enjoyed. When he returned to Vienna, he got a job at a business cycle institute. The Rockefeller Foundation was supporting lots of these institutes in Europe. He became a member of Mises's circle. It was just like the Geistkreis, but held at the Chamber of Commerce, where von Mises had an office, and they met weekly as well. So he's again back into that culture. Got married, and he qualified to teach. And the important step that he took at this point was that he had written a paper as he's qualifying for his exams, that ended up being read by Lionel Robbins. And Robbins liked the paper. He's a professor at the London School of Economics. The London School of Economics was brand new. It was founded in 1895 by Fabian socialists, but they employed whoever they thought was the best economist. And Lionel Robbins had gone through school there, went to Oxford for a while, and then was brought back to be a teacher. And Robbins was instrumental in getting Hayek invited by William Beveridge, the director of the LSE, to give a series of 4 lectures at LSE. And these lectures ended up becoming Prices in Production, for those who will see in terms of his books. This is his second book. And it made quite a splash because it took place in the early 30s. The Great Depression was coming on. It was still the slump of 1930. That's how it was described, but it was deepening. And so he's writing about monetary theory and the trade cycle in his first book, and then in Prices in Production, putting together the Austrian business cycle theory. And this made quite a hit. He ended up getting invited first to be an assistant, a visiting professor, full professor, and later was given a named chair, the Took chair. So it was quite successful. At a very young age, he has a named chair at the London School of Economics. And in this crucial period of the 1930s, when not only do you have the Great Depression, but you have in Europe the emergence of these alternating political systems. You have communism was suddenly being undertaken. It's been around for over a decade in the Soviet Union, but you've got fascisms of various types emerging on the continent. So it's a really interesting time period, a very fraught time period as we're heading into World War II. But it was also a tremendously interesting time for the development of economics. And one of the things that's not mentioned here is what came to be called the Grand Seminar, Lionel Robbins Seminar at London School of Economics, that Hayek joined along with Arnold Plant as the three directors of this seminar. And they were coming up with all sorts of developments in economics. George Shackle later described it as the years of high theory. And the people who were, coming to this seminar, you had John Hicks, Nicholas Caldwell, Ava Lerner, Michael Koleski, Shackle himself, Ludwig Lockman, and just an array of really, really great minds. And basically what we would think of as the sorts of diagrams that one would see in an intermediate price theory text or macroeconomics text as well, were all being developed in this seminar. And Hayek was watching the developments of this. He was running his own seminar on capital theory and theory of the cycle. So it was really a very, very important time in the development of economics. And again, he was right there. So think of where we've gone. He was in England, or rather, he was in the United States when Wesley Clair Mitchell, American institutionalist, is at his prime. He comes to England and he joins this seminar. Now, in addition to that, Robbins and Hayek are looking at the ideas of John Maynard Keynes as expressed in a treatise on money, and they think that this is all wrong. And we'll get to the debate between Hayek and Keynes from the Hayekian perspective. I know you've already talked about Keynes when we get to the substantive issues, but he's joining this Robbins seminar, but he's also interacting with John Maynard Keynes in a classic intellectual battle. From there, we can go to the beginning of World War II. So 1939, World War II begins in Europe. The LSE is in London, obviously, and initially it stays there, but once the bombing starts, it evacuates up to the London, up to Cambridge University. And Hayek is there. He had his own place for a while, and then he ends up bringing his family there. And he gets also rooms at King's, which is the college that Keynes was at, from John Maynard Keynes. So their relationship, I mention this only because the Keynes-Hayek battle is legion, but their relationship was actually a pretty close one, and it became even closer during World War II, because they were both in Cambridge. They were seeing each other quite frequently, going to dinner. Hayek would attend theater that was Keynes was helping to direct things at the theater, or not. He wasn't a director of the plays, but he was running a theater in Cambridge, so they became quite close at that time. He in World War II starts working on something called the Abuse of Reason Project, and this is a major 2-volume work that he intended to do. He never finished the big 2-volume work. He got a lot of other things that were published from it, but the most important one of these was The Road to Serfdom, which was published in 1944. And this is a book that ends up being quite important in the development of his career, not because of the book itself. The book itself probably would have been read by some people and it would be fine, but a Reader's Digest condensation of the book came out, which meant that millions upon millions of people ended up reading that condensation. So it got him his 15 minutes of fame, as Andy Warhol might put it. And one of the people that he got the attention of was a person who was running a foundation, an American foundation called the Volcker Fund, and they provided money for him to arrange a meeting or at least part of the funding came from the Volcker Fund, to arrange a meeting in Mont Pelerin, Switzerland in 1947. And this is the foundation of the Mont Pelerin Society, a classical liberal society of people who are studying classical liberal ideas, trying to figure out what the foundations of a classical liberal society might be, particularly in the 20th century. And we'll have more on that a little bit later. In 1950, he moves to the University of Chicago. A lot of the reason why was that he was divorcing his first wife and marrying a second wife, and wanted to live in America, wanted to be able to support his family in England. And Chicago is one of the places that was able to pay for this. Again, the Volcker Fund was involved in helping finance his salary during the period he's there. Well, he comes to the University of Chicago then in 1950. This is just as what we later would think of as the Chicago School of Economics is starting to get formed. So he actually knew Frank Knight, Milton Friedman, Aaron Director, and George Stigler. He had invited all of them to that 1947 meeting, that initial meeting at Mont Pelerin. So this was quite a gathering of people. In addition, there was other people. I mean, von Mises, Mocklip were there. Karl Popper attended the meeting. You know, so the list of people who attended that initial 1947 Mont Pelerin meeting are quite impressive. But anyway, he knew these Chicago people and ultimately got a job there. He was on the Committee on Social Thought, though. He was not a member of the economics department. And on that Committee on Social Thought, he turned his attention more towards social philosophy, I think would be the best way to describe it, or political philosophy. And many of his contributions then were in that direction. It culminates in 1962 with the publication of the Constitution of Liberty. He also writes a very interesting book just before he got to Chicago. He finished it before he got to Chicago, published in 1952, called The Sensory Order. So this is a book in theoretical psychology. So this guy's all over the map by the time we get to the 1950s. Anyway, he spends 12 years at the University of Chicago. He then spends the rest of his life first in Freiburg, in what was then West Germany, then Salzburg in Austria, and then he returns to Freiburg, and that's where he ends up dying. The major work during this period, I would say, is Law, Legislation, and Liberty, but it's also a time when he is awarded the Nobel Prize. He's awarded the prize jointly with Gunnar Myrdal. Gunnar Myrdal was politically on the opposite side of the spectrum from Hayek. Both of them complained rather bitterly about having the award being given to the other one. So there's some good stories there. His health really declines in the middle of the 1980s, but he ends up with the assistance of Bill Bartley, who was the first general editor of the Hayek collected works, in publishing a small book called The Fatal Conceit. And he dies in Freiburg in March 1992. So if we think about it, I mean, he was in Vienna when Ludwig von Mises was running a seminar. He comes to America when one of the fathers of American institutionalism, Mitchell, is doing his work. By the way, Mitchell is also involved with the NBER, another hugely important organization in the history of economics. He goes to England just as Keynes is becoming the Keynes who would publish in 1936 the General Theory, although their debate is about, as I said, on the treatise on money. He ends up going to the University of Chicago just as the Chicago School of Economics is being developed, and then is debating in the 60s and 70s with people who are emerging on the left side of the profession over questions of democratic planning, socialist planning, etc. So he's got a great, he's as I said before, he's a great vehicle for looking at the development of various things in the history of economics. Okay, so let's go over to his contributions. And what I'll first ask you to do is just take a scan, take a look at the whole page. Because you've got his initial work, A Model of a Capital Using monetary economy. So all those words are important. He wants to integrate capital theory into a theory of a monetary economy. And he had a number of different pieces there. His very first book, Monetary Theory in the Trade Cycle, emphasized the importance of money in explaining the cycle. Prices and production are his articulation in Austrian general theory of the economy. And then he has some papers in Prices, Interest, and Investment. And finally, the Pure Theory of Capital was a piece that he really labored over. It took him 7 years to get out. It comes out right as World War I is really heating up. So a lot of people didn't notice it that much. And by his own lights, he felt it was not really a success because he didn't get to the full description of a capital using monetary economy that he wanted to. His works on socialism and knowledge began in the 1930s, and we'll go through that. And both a critique of socialism, but also his independent contribution on what is sometimes called the knowledge problem is what we'll highlight when we go through it. The Abuse of Reason project, I already mentioned. This is his project during World War II. He got a number of essays. The scientism essay is a fascinating contribution. But The Road to Serfdom is probably, as I said, the most important one to come out of that particular period. He turns to political philosophy, as I said, in the 1950s and throughout. And the two big books, The Constitutional Liberty and Law, Legislation, and Liberty, are the contributions there. After about the mid-1950s, he started to be increasingly interested in what he later described as the twin ideas of spontaneous order and evolution. And he used these in trying to understand the emergence of complex phenomena. So we'll talk a little bit about that. He did have a small piece in the 70s called The Denationalization of Money that in a sense gave rise to some of the later work on well, and we can even think of Bitcoin as something that if you're thinking of the competitive issue of things that are not controlled by the government, that kind of thing, but also the ideas of free banking were revived with the contribution in this area. And finally, I said the interpretive puzzle of the fatal conceit, because it's not really clear who wrote it. If you go to the archives and take a look at the huge number of containers of drafts of this thing, and he had help from his secretary, he had help from Bill Bartley. You can definitely identify some Hayekian themes in this small little book, but there's also things that it clearly came more from Bartley, and maybe Hayek thought these were things that he wanted to include because he thought they were right, or maybe they were things that Bartley thought were more important. So anyway, that's where we're heading. So let's have a look then at some of the ideas, okay? And we're starting out with that monetary theory. So just by way of background, Hayek is living in Austria in the early 1920s. And although Germany had a really bad hyperinflation, Austria also had a bout of hyperinflation. And the penalty that hyperinflation imposes on a society, well, there's lots of them, but one of them is that it typically destroys the middle class, because people who had been, for example, good Austrian citizens and buying war bonds during World War I, giving the government all its money with a promise to be paid back, 5 or 6 years later with crowns. Well, after hyperinflation, they get paid back, and all of their savings that they put in these war bonds is gone. I mean, the currency is worthless. You see these pictures of children building toy houses out of currency because it had no value. So it's something that destroys the middle class and really sets up the sort of things that, in fact, emerged in Germany, in Austria, groups of violent young men out of work who are basically ruffians. The society rapidly was devolving into a fairly brutal state. Now, so the reason I'm pointing this out is that inflation then was always in Hayek's mind. That was the big fear that he had. And he retained that throughout, I think it's safe to say, the rest of his life. Whereas John Maynard Keynes, his great opponent when he comes to England, the problem that he saw in England in the 1920s was unemployment. Unemployment was high. As he put it in a memorable phrase, it was stuck in a rut. And he was seeing the problems that are associated with persistent high unemployment. So it's too much of a simplification to attribute their dispute or the debate as their two personal experiences. But those personal experiences, nonetheless, I think are quite important to bear in mind in understanding where they're coming from. So Hayek is worried about inflation, but he goes to New York. He's there for 15 months. He sits in on Wesley Clare Mitchell's class on types of economic theory, but he also sits in on the business cycle one. And Mitchell was famous. The Federal Reserve System in the United States was started in 1913. And by the 20s, the idea was, well, the Fed needs to stabilize an aggregate price level. That was kind of the policy prescription that was starting to come out as a role for the Federal Reserve Bank. And so Mitchell was, in Hayek's phrase, one of the stabilizers. And this didn't make sense to him. Hayek, he's in the Austrian tradition. You may have talked about the marginal revolution, which is the origin of microeconomics. And if you think of microeconomics, the emphasis in micro is always on relative prices. Here we've got this kind of macro kind of idea of stabilizing aggregate price level. It's not talking about relative prices, it's talking about an average. And particularly in Hayek's view that a developing economy tends to become more productive through time, so that you might have a gently declining average price level, in fact, as a healthy sign. Well, if you're trying to stabilize the price level, you might end up contributing to inflationary pressures. So he thought that stabilization policy that targeted an aggregate level didn't make much sense. The Austrian business cycle theory that he had in the back of his mind that he develops, and these are things that are being discussed in the various seminars that he's attending and the Mises-Kreis, are seeing the interest rate as just another price. And what do we think about, if we're good microeconomists, that prices coordinate behavior in markets? Okay, an equilibrium price equates supply and demand. Well, in the Austrian business cycle theory, the interest rate is also a price. And what it coordinates is intertemporal production and consumption decisions. Now, how does this work? Okay, if we think about the market for loanable funds, okay, so on the demand side, you've got firms that will borrow funds for capital investment purposes. And on the supply side, who supplies loanable funds? Households do. This is their savings. Okay, so you have basically savings and a demand curve for loanable funds giving you an equilibrium interest rate that coordinates. Now, how does that interest rate coordinate production and consumption decisions through time? Well, think of it this way. Let's go through a mental experiment. Let's say the society, why do people save? People save because they want something in the future. They're foregoing current consumption because they want something, some sort of thing or more of stuff in the future. Okay, so you save because you want more in the future. So let's say society as a whole increases the amount that it wants to save, that in general, people want more stuff in the future. The supply of savings, or the supply curve, shifts out. This lowers the equilibrium interest rate. That lower rate, as you move down that demand curve, induces firms to do what? Well, to undertake more capital investment projects. Okay, Baum-Bavarik, one of his teachers, well, he wasn't a direct teacher, but certainly somebody that he knew in Vienna through his father, had a big treatise on capital theory, and so the idea of roundabout methods of production being more productive was something that was part and parcel of the education that he'd had going through schooling in Austria. So for Hayek, this increase in capital goods means that there's going to be the ability for firms to produce more things in the future. Okay, so an increase in savings lowers interest rates. This causes firms to undertake capital investment. This capital investment makes them more productive, so there's going to be more stuff in the future. This is how it works. It's very smooth. It's an intertemporal coordination. People want more stuff in the future. The movement of the interest rate and the actions of firms, in fact, brings that about. So that's when a market system is working correctly. If you're trying to understand the business cycle, Hayek says, well, there's something else that can cause that interest rate to fall. And one of the things that can do that is an increase in money. And if you think of a money and banking class, an increase in the money supply, that pushes down interest rates. So you have the same process going on. But the big difference is people don't want more future goods. When the money supply increases and that pushes down interest rates, it induces firms to take actions thinking that people want more future goods, want to increase production for the future. And then they come to realize that, wait a second, in fact, people don't want that they have increased production and they're going to have a hard time selling the goods that they have, that they through time are increasing more of. It's at that point that firms recognize their mistake, they draw back, and that's what causes the business cycle to occur. So for Hayek and the Austrians, business cycles occur because of money. Money has so many, important uses. It's a unit of value. It facilitates trades. It can be a store of value. It's a unit of account, rather, and a store of value. But for Hayek, and this is his phrase, it's a loose joint. It's something that can cause the system to get out of balance. Now, how do you avoid that? Remember, he's writing in the Great Depression, for God's sakes. Okay, so this is an important policy question. And unfortunately, his answer is, you shouldn't have made the mistakes in the first place to increase the money supply beyond what it was. What we want to do, we understand perfectly what we need to do. We need to keep money neutral. But the best thing that we can do, once we've gotten into a situation of a recession, is just to let the thing play out. And that's not the sort of policy advice that people are going to want to hear. And obviously, it's quite different from the policy advice that would come out of a Keynesian model that was being developed at the same time. Okay, so this is the nature of the debate. I'll just say briefly what the terms of the debate were. So Hayek comes to the London School of Economics. Before he arrives, Lionel Robbins said, "Look, Keynes has just come out with a book called A Treatise on Money. Will you review it in Economica?" Hayek struggles with this review. He finds it a very difficult book. And I'll tell you, for people who are interested in the Hayek-Keynes debate, you can go back and read this stuff. You can read Prices and Production and Treatise on Money, and you will find them both to be very, very difficult reads, and probably not worth the investment that you would put in to do it. But anyway, so Hayek is struggling to write a review of this thing, and it comes out in the summer before he arrives. And it's the first part of a two-part review because he just didn't feel he could get a good statement of what the problems were that he saw in Keynes's book. Keynes gets the copy of the review and he is apoplectic. He is furious. His biographer, Keynes's biographer, said the copy of Hayek's review of A Treatise on Money is the most marked up thing in the documents that are there in Keynes's archives. He's just every other sentence, he's writing, "Oh, how can he say this? Oh, this is unfair, blah, blah, blah." So Keynes ends up responding to the review. This is a response that appears before the second half of Hayek's review even appears. And he defends himself, but he also goes on the attack. And he says, "Look, I may have made some mistakes in A Treatise on Money, but look at what look at this Hayek guy. I mean, his theory is it's garbage." So it's a very aggressive, he's given a chance to respond, and he responds by, in fact, attacking the other person's theory. So this is why it got attention. This was kind of an unprecedented occasion in terms of just the politeness of the way that literature used, the kinds of interactions that people used to have in print at the time. And this is why it got the attention that it did. Now, what we've got is then two competing theories about monetary economies and how they can go wrong. Keynes and Hayek both start saying, well, what we need to do is develop our theories better. As I said, Hayek works for much of the decade and publishes Pure Theory of Capital in 1941, a book that is little known and little regarded. But Keynes publishes the General Theory in 1936, and he does a very good job at promoting it. Some of Hayek's students at the London School of Economics went up to Cambridge and were visiting up there. Joan Robinson at Cambridge. The story here, the sociology of this whole thing is fascinating, and it's been much written about. So those who are interested in this, in how the Keynesian revolution came to kind of clear the field so effectively, not immediately, but certainly among the students at LSE and Cambridge in the late 30s. By the end of the 30s, Hayek is really a fairly lonely figure. Most of the students at LSE, these are graduate students, people like Caldwell and Hicks and the rest, Hicks was not a graduate student. Take that back. But the people that were at the seminar were much more impressed with the Keynesian message than they were with the Hayekian message, even those who had initially been quite attracted to it. Okay, the second area in which Hayek is making a contribution, this debate with Keynes is something that happens early on in the period. Hayek's attention becomes much more focused on socialism in the mid-30s. So let's figure out, and for those of you who are economists, or even if you're not economists, you have classes where you're talking about socialism. I think the first thing that you need to do is ask people, what do you mean by the word socialism? Okay, because it has really different meanings through time. But in the 1930s, in particular, and what people were calling for is end of private property in the means of production, no more private firms, nationalization, basically, of the means of production. So it's important to get that straight, because this was what was being promoted on the one hand by certain groups and opposed by people like Robbins and Hayek. So in 1930s, the intelligentsia in Britain, if you think about the context, you've got communism has arisen in the Soviet Union. And some people are quite enthusiastic about communism. I mean, Beatrice and Webb and Sidney Webb wrote a book, on communism, saying, well, this might be the future in the mid-30s. So there was certainly a group in the 30s among the intelligentsia who supported communism, but a lot of people also saw the obvious infringement on personal liberties that are involved in a communist society. So it wasn't that attractive to them. But you look on the continent, and as I said, in Spain, in Italy, in Germany, you have various forms of authoritarian governments taking over, and they are not attractive. Although, again, there were some people in England who were attracted to fascism as well. But the vast majority of the intelligentsia, and I don't mean just economists, I mean people who are public intellectuals, who are writing in newspapers, who are on the BBC giving lectures, who are giving lectures in the halls, not just university halls, but public halls. So all sorts of people who are speaking out on what is the appropriate response to the Great Depression. Well, it seemed like capitalism was dead. Okay, you're in the midst of the Great Depression. You have competing explanations for why it's dead, but it seems well and truly dead. But none of these alternatives, extreme alternatives of communism and authoritarian fascism and Nazism, were attractive. So what is the middle ground? The middle ground for many people, and it was called the middle way by many, was democratic socialism. Okay, we're going to get away from laissez-faire economics. We're going to have a socialist setup in terms of the economy, but we're going to integrate it into a democratic political setup. So democratic socialism was what people were arguing for. Now, Hayek had come from Vienna. There was an extensive literature that had developed after World War I in Austria, and the two big protagonists were Ludwig von Mises and Otto Neurath. Now, Otto Neurath was a socialist. He was a member of he's a philosopher, member of the Vienna Circle, so a prominent public figure. And he was making the argument that, well, we have in a war economy, the phrase he used, we have central planning. Why don't we just simply continue central planning after World War I in the economy? We will avoid the problems of the business cycle that plagues a free market economy, and it will be a more just economy because we'll have a better distribution of income. We'll be able to produce goods according to the needs of the population and not according to the vagaries of profit and loss. Okay, so this was the argument that was being made, and Ludwig von Mises wrote an article and then later a book criticizing socialism. And he said, well, yeah, it's just not going to work. It's just not going to work. And his argument was a fairly straightforward one. He says, well, if you don't have private property in the means of production, if you don't have firms, you have the government doing all production, you're not going to have prices for factors of production. So if you don't have prices for factors of production, how are firms going to make decisions about relative scarcity? Okay? The sort of thing that relative prices tells you is, what goods are relatively more expensive and which are not. And if you don't have that for prices of factors of production, it becomes really difficult to have rational production. As von Mises says, it's like people who are making decisions in firms are simply groping in the dark. So it was an important criticism of a socialist setup, but it was in German. And so Hayek's idea was, well, what I'm going to do, given this enthusiasm in England in the mid-30s for socialism, is to bring out a book. This is Collectivist Economic Planning, for which he offered an introduction and a conclusion. But in the middle of the book are translations of articles that were critical of socialism, one of them being von Mises's important 1920 article. Okay, so this is his initial contribution, but the debate had moved on. The socialists who were making these arguments in 1930s Britain, economic theory had developed from Walras and Pareto and Casale. You started to have general equilibrium theory developing. This seemed to be much more scientific. It's expressed in systems of equations. And the argument in general that was being made is, well, look, now that we have a better understanding of economies as a whole, you can represent either a socialist economy or a free market economy with this system of equations. And really the question then becomes, metaphorically, who's solving the equations? And under capitalism, it's entrepreneurs, but under socialism, it could be socialist managers. And indeed, if we take a look at Oscar Lange's seminal contribution to this debate in the mid-1930s, and he's someone who's associated with the phrase of market socialism. He said, look, and he made a very good joke here. He said, Ludwig von Mises is an institutionalist. Now, this is like the worst thing you can say to an Austrian, okay? He's kind of blaming him he's like Mitchell and them, Veblen, blah, blah. Because he thinks that prices have to be determined in a specific institutional setup of private property. But really, prices are just, price is a datum, okay? These are just data. And we can set prices at whatever we want. And then if we see that they're wrong, we'll adjust them up and down through just like a market does in demand and supply. And furthermore, we can instruct, now that we understand through this powerful tool of general equilibrium analysis, of what the best conditions would be for an economy, we can just tell socialist managers to duplicate the conditions that would exist under perfect competition. So we'll tell all managers of firms to set prices at marginal costs, and set the production level so that you're at the minimum point on your long run average cost curve. Okay, we can direct the economy in this way and be able to duplicate the advantages, all the advantages in terms of efficiency of a free market system with none of the disadvantages of externalities and business cycles and unfair distribution of income, all the rest. We can handle that. So this was the argument that he was facing in the 1930s. Now, his response comes in a little paper, also a very difficult paper to read, I should warn you, Economics and Knowledge. It was a presidential address at a club in London, published in 1937 in Economica. And he says, well, wait a second, we're having all these discussions. What kinds of assumptions are we making in our economic theories these days about the knowledge? It's called economics knowledge. What sort of assumption about the knowledge that agents have are we making? And he said, well, basically, what we're assuming is that every agent has full information, and that information is correct. And he said, well, if you assume that, you've given up the whole game. Of course, you're going to come to equilibrium fully. He says, in the real world, what we actually see are that different people have different bits of knowledge. Knowledge is localized, okay? And it's very specific. And some people are wrong about what they think is going to be happening now, or what is happening now and what's going to be happening in the future. So we can say knowledge is subjectively held, be a way to put that. It's not his phrase, but one I think that describes what he's getting at. And he said, so the real question becomes, if we actually live in the world that we live in, okay, where knowledge is dispersed and subjectively held, how in the world do we ever see any kind of coordination at all across all these different agents? How do the subjective things become coordinated with objective reality? That's the question he poses in Economics and Knowledge. And in a sense, he answers the question in The Use of Knowledge in Society, probably his most famous paper, published in 1945 in the American Economic Review, where he says, in fact, the price system is a marvelous mechanism. If somebody had invented it, they would have been held on a level up to that of Isaac Newton, but it didn't. It's just something that emerges through the interactions of agents and markets. But the market mechanism, a well-functioning market mechanism, when you don't have that loose joint of money messing things up, is a marvelous tool for coordinating behavior of agents in a situation of dispersed and localized knowledge. So how best to characterize the claim he's making? He's saying, well, if we think about it, as firms, as consumers, we're faced with making decisions. And in making these decisions, we have all the knowledge that we've got about the situation that we're facing, and then we have all these prices that are out there. And most of them don't concern us at all, but the ones that do are the ones that we're paying attention to. And as they go up and down, we change our behavior, okay? We react to that, okay? So this price system is giving all of us information, okay? That's collected out there. We don't know what's causing these prices to move, but it's information that we're using in making our decisions. Now, the crucial next step is to say, so where do these prices come from? And the prices come from millions upon millions upon millions of consumers and producers making decisions in markets, and that's what causes the prices to adjust in the various ways that they do. So prices are both things that affect our behavior, but our behavior is what creates this vast array of prices that helps coordinate activities. And when prices move in various directions, they provide incentives for us to react in the proper direction. If prices are going up, people are going to economize on their use of that good. It's going to be incentive for more firms to produce more of it. It'll be an incentive for entrepreneurs and people who are smart to think of new products that could be substitutes for that product. The standard stuff that we would do in an Econ 101 class about what happens when prices change and what sorts of effects it has in describing, the movement to the new equilibrium. Now, through all of this, one of the things that Hayek says is, this whole equilibrium metaphor and this metaphor of perfect competition. He says in the real world, what competition is it's not well captured by the idea of perfect competition. It's rivalry. It's a market order. He says instead of a competitive order that depends on firms moving or markets moving to equilibrium, he says this is a constantly changing order. we never get to equilibrium. It's a constantly moving set of processes, and this is why the Austrians are often associated with the notion of market order rather than equilibrium. One of the papers that is mentioned there is The Meaning of Competition. If people wonder about some representative pieces to read by Hayek during this period in particular, these are two really fairly accessible papers. I would used to assign the use of knowledge in society in a micro class, just an undergraduate micro class. And The Meaning of Competition, you could do the same thing with. It's a critique of the way that we conceptualize competition and the dangers in thinking that, in fact, this is something that represents reality. Okay, so moving on to the 1940s, we've got Hayek. He's moved up to Cambridge, and he starts this abuse of reason project. What in the world is that? This is a fairly, it's very Hayekian, because he says, okay, things are really going to hell here. Why did it happen? I know what I'll do. I'll write a 2-volume work explaining how we got into the mess that we did. And in the first volume, it'll be historical. I'll talk about the ideas that led us astray. And he goes back to the French Revolution, the École Polytechnique, the idea that you can, this is an engineering school, but it's also, you've got Auguste Comte there. And he's interacting with these people and saying, hey, we can engineer societies in ways that build on the kind of ideas that you get from these French engineers. And he then traces the movement of a set of ideas from France to Germany to England and to the United States. And he says there are people, and the ideas that these are pernicious, in his view, pernicious ideas, okay? Some of the phrases that he uses is scientism. So scientism is the idea that the best way to do science is to apply the methods of the natural sciences to areas where they don't apply. Scientism is a critical word. He's saying this is the wrong way to do science. You don't just say, look, let's just try to be like the natural sciences. That's scientism. And he said scientism and socialism moved together through the century into the 20th century. And that is what gave rise, in his argument, to some of these developments that we see emerging in the 30s and 1940s. The form that the scientific arguments would take would be different in different countries. You had Auguste Comte in France, but in Germany you have emergence of Marxism. And then later in Germany you have the welfare state under Bismarck. In England you've got the Fabian socialists. In the United States you've got the institutionalists. So you've got, the German historical school that was in Germany. These were conservative imperialists. The Fabian socialists were socialists. Wesley Clare Mitchell was a progressive. So these are not politically the same sorts of people, but the ideas that are motivating them, in Hayek's view, were similar. Okay, and this would be scientism and some form what he called the engineering mentality, the idea that you can use science to engineer society in the same way like an engineer would build a bridge. And he says that these ideas are pernicious because they give rise to centralized planning. And central planning puts the possibility out there of a person who can take control, who will then abuse that power. So the road to serfdom was meant to be, here's why this is dangerous, why some of these ideas that sound so good about being able to plan a society could end up centralizing power. And if the wrong people get into power, you end up having a very bad situation emerging. Okay, so this was his warning that he's offering in The Road to Serfdom. As I said, there was a lot of books like this in the 40s. It probably would not have had that big of an impact, except for the Reader's Digest version of it that came out and made him overnight an important figure. John Maynard Keynes read The Road to Serfdom. I haven't gone into how close, various details of how close they became, but he read it on the way back from Bretton Woods and wrote Hayek a letter saying, yeah, this is a great book. I'm in an agreement with it morally across the board. But the real question is, yeah, you say that you have to be afraid of having too much government, but how do we figure out how much government we should have and how much not? How do we make that decision? What you're very good, Fritz, at I don't know if you called him Fritz, but you're very good, Hayek, at criticizing socialism. But what is the society that you'd most want? What does it look like? And we can think of what he does in the 1950s in America with the Constitution of Liberty, is trying to figure that out. And indeed, in the Mont Pelerin Society, founded in 1947, he said what we're about here. Yeah, nobody likes liberalism anymore, but we think this few people who are gathered at Mont Pelerin in 1947 think that is something worth preserving. What are the principles underlying a liberal society that we would like to promote? And he says, we're not going to do propaganda. We're not going to be getting out there trying to influence politics directly, but we need to come up with a set of principles that would underlie liberalism in the 20th century. So I will talk a little bit about what he came up with. I mean, it's a big, thick, long book, but in a capsule summary, it would be a market system and a democratic polity operating under the rule of law. The rule of law is absolutely essential in his discussions in this period. The idea that law is general, that it's equally enforced, that it's prospective, that it doesn't target particular individuals, but it's general, that no one's above the law, that applies equally. And the whole point of the rule of law is to avoid the twin evils, which are kind of the twin sides of a coin, either granting privilege to certain groups, that's when certain groups gain, or discriminating against certain groups. He says, if you've got the rule of law, it's at least an attempt to find a principle by which you avoid either granting a privilege or discrimination. So this was the fundamental message, and he talked about various political institutions, the separation of powers, bicameral legislature, these sorts of things are all part and parcel of it. But most importantly, he said there should be a private sphere of individual activity that the government cannot interfere with unless you are violating one of these general laws, like murdering people or stealing from people or committing fraud. Okay, those are general laws that are in place. But if you're not violating them, then you're free to engage in the business that you at hand. How are we doing on time, Fernando?
So we can have 10, 15 more minutes.
Okay, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about the spontaneous order and notions of evolution. And spontaneous orders. So he's interested in understanding the emergence of various social institutions. And he says many of these, we have planners who say what we need to do is intervene and plan a society that is more rational. And he says what these planners fail to recognize is the emergence of institutions that and this is an idea that he uses Karl Menger, one of the founders of marginalism, his book on methodology as a source here of institutions that emerge without anyone planning it. People are taking actions that are purposeful, but their purpose is to accomplish certain goals, and it's the unintended consequences then of intentional human action. So people are acting purposefully, but they're generating institutions that help them, but they don't plan on creating these institutions. He says, excuse me, this is something that the planners just don't have any sense of. So what is he talking about here? Now, I'll bring up some examples. I mean, certainly a market system. People are engaged in market behavior. My description, and you can again look at the use of knowledge in society, of how a market system is coordinating human action in a world of dispersed knowledge is an exact example. Economists are very good at that. Another one would be the emergence of certain market institutions like money. He said, if we look at Karl Menger's discussion of money, he said money was basically the good that is most accepted in exchange. Something that emerges as money is something that people know that if they accept it in exchange, other people will want it, so they'll be able to trade it for the goods that they want, thereby overcoming the mutual coincidence of wants sort of dilemma that you have in a society of simple barter. Okay, so money would be another one. And if you look at Adam Smith's treatment of money is along the same lines. These are not ideas that are they go way back in terms of discussions of money. His bizarre, perhaps, but very fascinating book, although it took me a long time to have any sense of what it was about, of the sensory order. He says, well, yeah, think of what we're experiencing, you and I, right now in this seminar. Okay. You see me, I see you, I see some heads, I'm thinking. But where does that come from? Where does this consciousness come from? And he says, well, we know that there are billions upon billions of neurons that are all interlaced and hierarchical sets of neuronal connections that give rise to this thing that we are experiencing. These neurons are not attempting to create consciousness, but their interaction is what allows us to actually be trying to follow this argument that Hayek is making in the sensory order. He says that that moral codes are another example, and the moral codes that ended up being successful. Here he likes to quote people like David Hume, who talked about the stability of possession, transference by consent, and the performance of promises, that these are certain fundamental ideas that emerge in certain societies, and where they emerge, you end up getting a more stable set of social behaviors that allow that society to prosper. Where if you could imagine societies where these things are not held as moral issues or as moral positions to be defended, you could see where pretty quickly things would go downhill. He says these morals then give rise to laws. Okay, they end up getting formalized later, and these laws then become part and parcel of society. He says this is the origin of the rule of law. He goes back in Constitution of Liberty, looking back at the Greeks and others who had written about it. He said, but basically these are things that emerge that allow societies to prosper. And he says, and this would be towards his later work. Yeah, some people say, well, he seems very conservative in his later work. He's not really. I think of him as a liberal, very much so, rather than a conservative. But because he starts to say, well, there's traditions that are pretty important. Things survived for a reason, and we don't always know what the exact reasons are. But many of these, kind of moral codes that we sometimes see as being outdated are in fact there for a reason, and they help preserve things. This is him writing in the 60s and the 70s. You've got Marcuse, you've got people who are using Freud to say, oh, yeah, Victorian, all these sorts of moral codes. This old-fashioned stuff. He's reacting to that at the same time that he's writing about these social issues. I think I'll stop there. I think I've gotten pretty much far enough. Certainly thrown out some things that are available for further discussion and inspection if we go. And thank you for your attention. I hope I haven't been speaking too fast, but I get excited and I start to. You should see my space here. I'm trying to keep my hands from waving around too much. Okay, Fernando.
Great. Thank you, Bruce. As always, you can please put your questions in the prompt. So we already have a few. So let's start with a broad one. Adam Smith and Karl Marx began as philosophers who later shifted their focus to economics, while Friedrich Hayek took the opposite path, starting as an economist before turning to philosophy later in his life. Is he unique in that regard?
Ooh, that's a great question. That's a great question. So I don't know if he's unique. I'd be interested in the person who asked the question following it up, if he can think of people who might also have followed that path. But I should say, though, the characterization of Hayek being an economist who then turns to philosophy is not completely accurate, because when he was a student in Vienna, in the university student from 1918 to 22 or 23, His initial attraction was towards psychology. And indeed, he wrote a student paper that remained unpublished, but he finished it in 1920, that basically pulled out of the drawer 25 years later, started working on it, and became the sensory order. So he was an economist, but I should also point out he was trained as a lawyer. I mean, in the Austro, also in the German system, but Austrian system at the time, the way you did economics was you got a degree in law, and it was one of the areas that you could do it. So he, in a sense, I mean, he learned his economics from von Bavarik, and then he learned a different type of economics in the grand seminar at the London School of Economics in the 30s, and yet another type that he was exposed to when the Coles Commission was there at the University of Chicago in the 1950s. It was again quite different from what he was used to in terms of the formalisms, but also just in terms of the approaches that people were taking and what people thought were scientific. So I think, actually, in a sense, being exposed to the different ways that economics was changing through time may also have been part of what pushed him in the direction of philosophy. But a great question, great question. If there are people who have gone more exclusively from economics into philosophy, I'd be interested in hearing about that.
A question by Carl's, which was prompted by your early remarks on World War I. He says, could you please elaborate further on Hayek's experience during the war and how they influenced his way of thinking?
Yes. So I don't know if they had any influence at all on his way of thinking. Okay, so I should say that. But he was he was quite eager to get to the front, and they got to the front right after a big Austrian push that ended up on the Piave River in Italy, and it's a broad, shallow river. So the British and Italian troops were quite far away, and they just sat there. Okay, they just sat there for a long time. So he was bored senseless. So they did do some things though that ended up being fairly bizarre. One of them, and he tells this story. This is a Vienna coffee house guy. He can tell a good story, and the story is, well, they had the bright idea that they wanted to be able to see what the other troops on the other side were doing. So they started putting people up in balloons. So he had this experience where and he has a telephone, okay? And they put him up in a balloon. He has a telephone. He's supposed to tell his side what's going on. Well, it's a disaster. He says the first time, they wanted to make sure that he would be able to get out of the balloon if it was shot. So they gave him a parachute to jump out, and he gets all tangled up. The phone line and the parachute gets all tangled up, and he almost dies. Another time, it comes down in a kind of a swampy area, almost drowns. He says, and I couldn't see anything from up there. It was just So he's just talking about life at the front in a way that's pretty amusing. He was fascinated by airplanes. Somebody who was always fascinated by the latest changes, technological changes in society. So he very much wanted to fly. So he went up on 3 different occasions with pilots to just see, again, trying to do observations of what's going on behind the lines. And 2 of the 3 ended up crash landing. Luckily, made it back to behind their line. So he had lots of adventures that way. He didn't really engage in a major battle. He engaged in a major retreat, and he said that was actually the scariest part of the war because of just this disorder that existed. You had the Austrian Empire had like people with speaking 8 or 10 different languages. And he said, it was just kind of a mess there. A lot of people ended up getting killed just through the disorderly retreat that he engaged in. So that's all I got. And how did that affect his thinking? I don't know. I mean, who can tell? Who can tell?
Jetri asks, as someone who's still learning about how markets behave from a sociological and political lens, I would love to know more about what will be some ways that we move from this equilibrium state, which paradoxically seems to be in a constant state of flux, to a more of a market order.
Yeah, so I think his emphasis on market order has to be viewed and the Austrian emphasis on that, in contradistinction to the way that social processes and markets were being modeled as using the notion of equilibrium. Because equilibrium says this is, you're returning to a state of rest. And the notion of returning to a state of rest, even though it's very useful for a demand and supply diagram to say, okay, if there's a change somewhere and you move in this direction, says that this is an artificial metaphor for understanding the process that takes place because it's constant and it's ongoing. In 1981, he gave a lecture at the London School of Economics that was to celebrate the 50th anniversary of his prices and production lectures that he did in the early 30s. And in this lecture, he offers a metaphor of a stream as being a better metaphor. And what's fascinating is that Alfred Marshall, who you may also have encountered in this course, if you take a look at his description of a market coming to equilibrium, as it were. I mean, he's the guy who's most famous for these diagrams. He says it's really the best way to think of it is of a rock suspended by a string in a stream that's jumping up and down, which is totally Austrian. So it is a matter of what metaphor is most useful in understanding some sort of social or economic process. And so his emphasis on the emergence of an order is that you're constantly moving in the right direction, but the goalposts keep changing. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
Argeno asks, which elements of Hayekian economic thought can be considered heterodox today and which can be assumed to be part of economic orthodoxy?
So I would say that the use of knowledge in society is an article that is cited by people in the economics of information, on mechanism design, all different sorts of areas. So I think that definitely is a contribution that would be part of the orthodoxy. I think his critique of socialism, even though politically there's many people who describe themselves as democratic socialists, I'm not really sure what that means. That the notion of what socialism was really started to change in the 1950s. A lot of British socialists who had endorsed nationalization of the means of production as a policy for Britain, by the 50s was backing away from that extremely much. And they were emphasizing things like social justice, taking care of the poor, proposing various redistributive policies that they thought were the best ways of accomplishing these goals. I should point out liberals also want to accomplish those goals. They have different policies, okay, in terms of what they think are effective policies for trying to accomplish them. But I think his critique of nationalization of the means of production as just a non-starter is something that is widely accepted. The most interesting thing is that there are discussions, and these discussions started as early as the late 1960s, when Oscar Longa said, well, now that we've got computers, socialist calculation debate, we don't have to worry about that. We just plug everything into a computer and spit it out. And now with AI, I mean, this with each new technological innovation, people who are promoting socialism say, now we have the technical ability to be able to accomplish these goals. There's a nice discussion of some of these questions in the journal JIBO, Journal for Industrial Organization and Behavior. That I think gets at some of the issues that still would persist even in a world of advanced AI. And I think actually, indeed, my host Jesus has written on this as well. So I'd recommend that you have a look at his work as well. So those are the things that I think would be part of orthodoxy, the critique of socialism, and the role of markets in coordinating economic activity in a world of dispersed knowledge. The part that would remain more heterodox, I think, is probably there are people who still want to go back to prices and production and say that Austrian business cycle theory is effective. I'm not among those, but I would recommend, let me just pull it up because right here. The best Austrian treatment, I don't know if you can
show
see
it close to your head.
Put it close to my head.
Yes. Well,
Okay,
instead of you, in your face, actually.
I'll just say the name.
Yeah.
It's Lawrence White's Better Money, Gold, Fiat, or Bitcoin. Larry White has been both an expositor of Austrian business cycle theory and Austrian approaches to money, a critic. He's criticized Hayek. I mean, he's an excellent economist, and it's a really great book for kind of understanding the problems of money. I mean, I think Hayek was exactly right when he said that money is a loose joint, and it's really difficult to figure out. And if you take a look at the writings of Milton Friedman, Jim Buchanan, Hayek, others who have tried to grapple with what do you do, what do you do when you've got money to make it so that it doesn't become a loose joint. Yeah, Hayek himself had lots of different answers to that question over the course of his career, others as well. So it is difficult, but that would be where I would start if you have an interest in that particular area.
So Alexander has an interesting question about Hayek's character. He says, contemporaries said that Hayek had a reputation of being a terrible teacher with a thick Austrian accent, little charisma. Do you think his defeat in the intellectual joust with Keynes in the theories came from that?
Well, he certainly was outclassed in terms of Keynes's superb ability to debate in the English language. Okay, and indeed, the descriptions that Hayek himself gives of Keynes, it says, his voice was just so powerful. And just so effective, and he was a great rhetorician. So certainly, at least part of what would explain on the ground the success of someone like Keynes versus someone like Hayek is those personal characteristics. In terms of being a teacher, I think that he did have a thick accent. He was pretty much knew what he wanted to say, but I mean, a lot of times if you take a look at videos of him giving lectures, yeah, he's got a lot of interesting things to say, but he's saying it at a pretty high level, and he doesn't pander to his audience. He doesn't try to dummy things down for people. So I mean, I talked to Sam Pelsman, who was at Chicago when Hayek took the History of Thought course, and he said, yeah, he wasn't a dramatic lecturer to be sure, but he was very steady, and he said he got a lot out of the course. So I think it would, if you're looking for somebody who is going to entertain you in class, it's not going to be Fritz Hayek. I'll tell you that. He's not a Friedman. He's not a Stigler, who had two very other different personalities in class that were quite interesting. But he's just very underplayed. Okay, very undramatic throughout.
Is it true that Chicago economists opposed Hayek's appointment to the economics department, leaving him to join the Committee on Social Thought instead?
No, I don't think that is an accurate rendering. And there's a great article by a guy named David Mitch, that looks at it in detail. John Neff, who was on the Committee on Social Thought that hired Hayek, had promoted Hayek back in 1946 as someone to come to the department, and there was not enthusiasm at that point for hiring him. But the claim that had been subsequently made was, well, it's because the road to serfdom discredited him. Didn't have anything to do with that. I think it had more to do with the fact that he was not as technical as the people that they ended up hiring. So there was an initial consideration of him back in 46, but later Neff came. So the claim that I'm disputing is the claim that he wasn't hired because of the embarrassment of the road to serfdom at the time may have caused. The Committee on Social Thought was something that Neff and Frank Knight and others had created in the years of World War II, early 40s. And Neff had always wanted somebody who was more, kind of had broader interests. And the Abuse of Reason Project, the various papers that came out of that, like Individualism, True and False, and the rest, were things that got Neff's attention and made Hayek very attracted to him. Frankly, though, it's not clear whether the University of Chicago would have been able to hire Hayek had it not been for funding that was provided by the Volcker Fund. And this was again the guy who had seen Hayek talk about the road to serfdom when he was on a road trip promoting the book, was instrumental in both the creation of the Mont Pelerin Society and ultimately in paying not only Hayek's salary, okay, so bringing Hayek to the Opinion on Social Thought in 1950, but also Aaron Director's salary at the law school. Both of those things were funded by the Volcker Fund. So the interaction. One of the things that's very fascinating for me as an historian looking at this period is the interaction of these intellectuals with these various foundations who have they have their own motivations for what they're trying to do, just as people like Hayek and Director have motivations for what they're trying to do. Very interesting period.
Lucas asks, there is some controversy if economics should be defined by its methods or its object of study. Some economists have argued in favor of a definition of economics that should focus on markets and analyzing prices more for what they are rather than judging what they ought to be. Do you believe this is a productive discussion that could have an impact on how people perceive the discipline and the policy actions that are taken based on economic theory?
Yeah, that's at a very, very high level of thought. And I'm trying, I mean, Hayek and people like Jim Buchanan did want to emphasize the market as a means of bringing people into coordination with each other in in markets. I mean, in allocations of goods. They tended to be less comfortable with the idea of developing allocation processes for allocating, resources in that way. They thought that markets were pretty good at that, but they didn't have a fetish about what economists would call efficiency. So I mean, I think that if you look at the work of Pete Boettke in particular, he tries to distinguish between what he calls mainline economics and mainstream economics. And the distinction that he draws that I think is useful is mainline is the sort of economics that you would get if you started to say, what sorts of things do people like Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill, Alfred Marshall, and then moving into the 20th century, Milton Friedman, Buchanan, Vernon Smith, and others, property rights literature and others have in common. That's the main line of economics that have certain ideas that have persisted through time for good reason, versus mainstream, which is whatever the latest flavor is. And often, you'll see these things that will come and they'll be very, people get graduate training and the stuff will disappear and it will no longer be important. And if you've got tenure by that point, no problem. But it's not necessarily going to, even though it's the latest flavor, it might not be something that's going to last. So trying to pick out the things that last, I think is kind of the Austrian approach, the approach that would be associated with some of these other figures that I mentioned.
Argeno asks, in addition to the books you have written or the ones that you have mentioned, is there any other book that you would recommend about Hayek? I would add to it, would you recommend his own intellectual memoir, Hayek on Hayek?
So Hayek on Hayek is basically a collection of interviews in a sense that he gave. So it is, of the ones that collect the interviews, that would be one I'd recommend, but actually online is a series of, and it's a transcript of about 500 pages, that is a series of interviews that Hayek gave in 1978 and 79. So it's after he got the Nobel Prize, he became kind of a public figure himself. And the interviewees, the interviewers rather, the people who were interviewing him, included people like Robert Bork, who was the person who was nominated but never became a Supreme Court justice. You had Jim Buchanan. You had Axel Leyenhoefd and his wife, Erlene Craver. So there's some really great interviewers. And he talks about his life. He talks about his ideas. It's something that I can recommend as a way to get into Hayek's ideas. That's kind of fun. And it's very random because each interviewer offers different sets of questions, and so it shows him at his coffee house best, I think.
So one final question is, what underexplored areas in Hayek's work deserve more attention?
I certainly think that an understudied part, although it has been mentioned recently in the Wall Street Journal, a couple of letters, is his contributions to basically AI, as it were. So his theory of, or rather, the sensory order as a book, most people didn't understand it, but a few people did think it was interesting. And Hayek thought, I just didn't get my ideas across. So he started to work along lines, and he has an unpublished paper. It was unfinished and remained unpublished until the collected works came along, talking about systems within systems. And it's his attempt to model a system that is trying to accomplish a goal. He doesn't get very far. But I would recommend that the people who might be interested in this sort of part of Hayek's oeuvre to take a look at both the collected works volume that is on the sensory order, edited by Victor Vanberg, because it includes both the sensory order, but every one of these volumes in the collected works has an editor's introduction, as well as extensive explanatory footnotes when Hayek makes references to things that might not be things that people know today. And so it's very useful in that regard. And secondly, a book, one of the volumes in the collected works that I edited, The Market and Other Orders, talks again about how he extended these ideas of the market order and started to see orders in other phenomena, and tracing out the importance of that in terms of our way of going about doing social science. So I think those are two things that I could recommend to look at areas that we don't usually think about when we think about Hayek that might prove useful to look at.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Bruce.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. I'm sorry I can't see all of the faces that might be out there, all three of them, but thank you for having me, and I enjoyed it very much. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the lectures. I'm sure this has been a great series.
Yeah. So thank you all the attendees. So we have come to an end. So we have one final week left where we were discussing Friedman, and then we will close with the bridging to the modern economics. So thank you and see you next week.